Thanks. We're just, we know it's Saturday, so we want to make sure everyone gets out of here too at a reasonable time. My name is Eva Salinas, or Eva Salinas, depending on which language I'm using. I just wanted to say, where's Susanna? She's here. Is she here? Oh, she did. What a fantastic kind of opening to the next couple of discussions. And because we had originally thought we'll do both at the same time, but we've decided it would be of great value if you're all here in this room and get to hear both of us and get to take part in the discussions that both of us will facilitate. Brent and I, we're going to condense them, obviously, but it kind of makes sense and actually works really well because essentially I was kind of going over some of the same things that were mentioned just now. So in a way, that was a great primer and kind of dive into what is disinformation. But what I really want to do, and I hope what will be useful is if we can actually pull out the practical applications of what we just heard and talked about. And so I know it was mentioned at the beginning, just what kind of journalism you do, what outlets you may work for or may work for in the future. But I want to get right into that and kind of pull out some of the stories and challenges because, of course, we have all heard about disinformation for quite a while now, if not since the beginning of any work in journalism. You want to get things right. I mean, that's always been a core principle of journalism, but it's increasingly become more important. Well, anyway, it's always been, but it's definitely under the microscope, even more so in the last couple of years. But as we know very well, it's one thing to know that, but there's all kinds of reasons why it's hard to do when you're doing a story, when you're on the job, and even more so when you work for a smaller outlet or organization. So a little bit about me, because that is where I think, and hopefully my own experience becomes relevant here. I've worked for all kinds of different media. From large, I was a reporter for the Globe and Mail, an editor for the National Post. But for the last 5 years, I've been the managing editor of a digital website called opencanada.org. It covers Canadian foreign policy and global affairs kind of more broadly. But we're a team of 2 people. Very, very small. Sometimes it feels like 1.5 because I don't mean to devalue my colleague, but so we're funded by a think tank in Waterloo called the Centre for International Governance Innovation. Used to be funded by a Toronto-based think tank called the Canadian International Council. But my one colleague, who's our senior editor, Catherine Salinas, does work for the think tank more broadly as well. So when I say it's sometimes a 1.5 person operation, I kind of have her as my second editor some of the time. So it's a really, really small team. And so I will hopefully kind of bring out some of the examples that I've had to deal with and what really puts all of this into perspective on why it's so hard, when you're working either alone, and that's also as a freelancer, and don't have the luxury sometime of, a guiding editor or a whole team or a number of different, when I was at the National Post, I mean, it's at least being read by 5 different people, and there's the layout person and the copy editor and even the one who's, writing the headlines and kind of doing the very final page design, who's going to catch, there's all that kind of safety net along the way. So yeah, I was just saying, although you had stepped out, Susanna, just how great that was as an introduction, and it works so well with what we're going to get into now, because part of what I was going to include is maybe a bit of overlap, although we can always hear it more and more times. Just like disinformation, if you hear it so often, you start believing it. The tools to fight disinformation, we need to hear it several times. So yeah, that's just a little bit about me and the work that I do. Again, you've just heard this earlier today about disinformation versus misinformation, the terms that we are most commonly using, not fake news, and why. It's often a term used against journalists, as was mentioned. I did put in deep fake as another term because we are hearing that more as well, which relates to video and imagery. Unfortunately, with the audio. I have this one clip, and you'll all receive this presentation and these links afterwards. But this was a clip. There's a podcast that Kevin Newman now runs called Attention Control. And so they're one of the recent episodes, actually, and the clip I was going to play is an interview with someone from Elections Canada talking about how they're combating disinformation and all of the questions that they don't have answers to because there's a lot of kind of muddiness around it. But Taylor Owen, who actually created Open Canada, the site that I edit now, and was up until recently a journalism professor at UBC, he's now at McGill. So the clip I was going to play, which I also have in the slides here, was just about how tricky it really is, and we know that so well. But they listened to a clip that sounds like something Andrew Scheer said, but just kind of talking about how do we know when it's audio, especially, or video, or images, just how easy it can be done now to create something that's fake, and how do we basically, I'll just read a little bit of it. That audio clip is relatively easy to manipulate and fake. And how do you put that back in the bottle once it's been seeded, once there have been news stories that have amplified it, once people that are most perceptible to believing or be affected by that message hear it? And so that goes back to just some of the things that I wanted to talk about. The gray areas and questions. What is our responsibility as journalists? Where are the limits of our responsibility? Because we're not the sole responsible actors here. There are many. And so it doesn't completely fall all on our shoulders. And how does it apply and impact your own work? Okay. So I'm going to go through these extremely quickly because I think the value here is if we get right into the exercises that I was hoping we would do. In fact, you know what? I'm just going to go right to that slide. Okay. You know what? I've just, yeah, okay. I mean, maybe it's useful. We have the examples, so I'll skip those. But maybe it's useful just to kind of remind just how serious of a problem it is, as was mentioned. But just on the multiple polls, even though polls themselves, there was a study by CG, who funds the site that I edit, that talked about 90%, or I think it was 89% of Canadians have admitted that they have fallen for fake news. There was a piece in the Globe and Mail by Simon Hoopt, who covers media issues, and said the report on fake news is fake news, and I thought that was slightly irresponsible to headline it, kind of using the term against it, and I thought, wow, we're really going into tricky territory calling that fake news. But it did bring up some interesting points around studies, and when we report on studies, sometimes we are having to simplify them when we write a news, or summarize them in a way that doesn't get into the nuance, doesn't get into how a study was created, whether there was blind spots, what might have been missed, how the information might have been manipulated in a way that, not that the CG study was out to manipulate information, they wanted to highlight a very serious and real problem. But that was kind of the heart of the Globe rebuttal to it. But I mean, the CG report is dead on. It's also very, gets into kind of, and there's been a few studies on it, where are we getting our news from? When we're getting them from friends, are there times when I wanted to get news from an organization, or getting news from friends or through social media is all right? This is the percentage of the confusion of journalism authenticity. So there is a lot of confusion right now. And so, yeah, I won't go too deep into that, because I think this group seems to be pretty aware of the nature and seriousness of the problem. Obviously, too, the impact on our democracy in the upcoming election is potentially big. Not, as was mentioned, kind of the jury is out on how big of a problem it is for foreign interference. Definitely already has been acknowledged that it is an issue. Chrystia Freeland, the foreign minister, has come out to say, we do know that it is happening. We just don't quite know the scale of it. And I think because obviously Donald Trump's election was really the big case study on it, this is really the first election for Canada since that time. And so it's actually almost like our first really big test case too. So there's a lot of attention on it this time around. And so it's hard to say in the lead up, but I think we are going to see quite a bit come out after this election to say, how serious was this problem? What did we learn from this election? Because I think, more than ever, we have all eyes on it, from research, academics, media, government themselves, foreign actors. I mean, there's a lot of cooperation globally on this. So a lot of, quote, like-minded countries are sharing information on what they've learned and trying to protect their own electoral process in the future. So we're really, really in a stage of learning on this. Okay. All right. So I want to know a little bit about you. Here we go. I'm just giving all these slides. A lot of it is the checklist, and I will go through them. But some of which, we've heard this earlier this afternoon. So what I want to do is first get into very small groups. 2 or 3 people, maybe just the person next to you or the whole row, if that's easier. And I want to hear, when we come back to talk about it afterwards, just what kind of journalism you're doing, what kind of outlets you work for, what languages do you write in or research in? Are you speaking to contacts only through Facebook? Are you talking to people who there's a blackout, internet blackout in another country? And what are your sources? I want to get into kind of who are you using for sources, any stories that you've worked on in the past that you want to go over your process. Are you alone in your fact checking? Is there an editor? And if you're a student journalist, any kind of, even as student journalists, we're still reporting, often writing for student publications, or we're sharing news online. And so what is your own process when it comes to sharing news, creating news? So I have a few different things here. So identify the challenges you faced. So case studies, and I think this will just help others, prompt them to think, oh, maybe I should have done this story differently, or maybe next time if this falls into my lap, I might change my own method, or is there a step I can add in? And that goes into kind of the question number 2, kind of brainstorming strategies that you could use. So identify the steps to take when working on a story, the resources you have. If you're working alone, do you have peer support or industry support from someone else who's also a freelancer or an editor at another outlet that you can speak to? I'll give you an example. A few stories that I've worked on. So one was really interesting. We published a story. So the site that I edit, we mostly have freelance contributors. So I'm working with writers all over, and I also understand their vulnerability as a freelancer. We did publish a story that looked at, and this was under Stephen Harper, I believe, the Canadian government's policy around, or the response to a new settlement in Gaza by the Israelis. And so we wrote this story about the Canadian government's response. Again, we focus on Canadian foreign policy. And there is a site gosh, I should remember the name. I believe it might just be responsiblejournalism.ca, something like that. But it's So it's actually, the full name is Responsible Journalism on Israel. So it's a site that checks stories that report on Israel. And they wrote me and said, you're basically spreading fake news. You've called the Gaza an occupation, that Israel occupies Gaza. We demand a correction. And it wasn't the first time we've had emails like that. And again, small team, not a lot of precedent set internally. And so, of course, I'm kind of looking, and not that I would dismiss that outright, even though that's what the writer had said. And you go think back over to your own process. How many things in the story do I assume as an editor or kind of take for granted as fact, right? I mean, there's every single sentence can be fact checked at the end of the day, right? There's so many pieces of information in one given article or paragraph even. And so then you start to, especially small independent site, you start to double guess yourself. Was I check? Then I basically kind of combined a bunch of sources from the Washington Post, Globe and Mail. How are the, then I'm finding columns even within the Washington Post saying, should we call it an occupation or not? And it turns out, in this particular case, very tricky, right? There didn't seem to be one answer, but it did seem to be that there was a consensus broadly, and I was able to draw enough examples of mainstream media and trusted media sources where it had been defined that way. But I had a back and forth with this person who was writing on behalf of this organization that was respectful, that was open. And, as journalists, I think we also need to be able to be open enough to admit if we've gotten something wrong. And also I reached out to a few others from a friend at the Star, for instance, just to have a chat about it. So it is tricky. It's challenging when, especially it's a smaller organization. But you have to be able to reach out, find the best practices, see what other organizations are doing. And then third, the case study. I did kind of want to bring it up because we didn't know if it would be front of mind today, and maybe the news cycle goes so fast, but about Trudeau and brownface. The Time piece, if you read the first one that came out, was pretty interesting. And I'll actually just give you a snippet. To read, I imagined, there's been questions around why Time ran this piece as opposed to a Canadian outlet. But as soon as I read that, it was so interesting because I thought, what if that picture had circulated first on social media, right? Could it have been faked? How do we know it was real? Some of the other ones, it was, I thought, hard to tell it was Trudeau in the picture. And so I thought, what would I have done if that were me as a journalist to receive that photo? It almost seems like, oh great, get the story out within that day. We don't know the full behind the scenes story of how long they've had that photo and have been able to do you know? Do tell.
Well, I just, it was interesting because Mercedes Stevenson from Global News, right? So she obtained the video, right?
Yes.
But I watched her report, and this is where it came out. She said that Global had that picture 2 days earlier and had been trying
to confirm,
to get Trudeau's team to confirm it, and they couldn't. So I guess they just, the person who had the photo, the yearbook, went to the Times and not Global, and Global didn't know how to get but that's, to me, what's really interesting, right, is that when was the photo taken? 2001? You've had all this time to come out at some point in your career as a teacher or your political career as the leader. Right? First he was a candidate, then the leader of the party. Now the prime minister, at any point in those however many years, you could have said something and you didn't, right? And now, Global has it for 2 days, and the party refused to confirm it. To me, that's fascinating. Mercedes is peeling back the curtain, right, on that.
They confirmed the time.
Right.
So it is confirmed to Global, they confirmed the time.
Because Time had the yearbook.
So that's the quotes that I've taken here are from the story, where it shows basically a few different ways that Time did fact check essentially the picture. One, they had a copy of the yearbook, but again, that could be doctored, right? It could be a whole publication. It could have been done, it's been politicized. It could have been done by, an opposing party, or who knows, somebody outside but who had their own ambitions. so they had the yearbook. They also reached out to multiple people who attended the gala, which the photo was taken at in 2001. Some of which said they didn't remember. Obviously, they were trying to find people to say, yes, that was him, I remember. Some didn't remember. But obviously, they were able to get the confirmation from Trudeau's office. So all of those things combined, you're shaking your head.
But I'm saying it's only been like 18 to 20 years since that photo got leaked. So like people are saying they don't remember, but they definitely do.
Well, and was it leaked 18 years ago? Because I was still, and maybe, yeah.
There's a picture of him in an Aladdin costume.
Right.
And that was from, I think,
2001.
yeah, his age was also in it as well. So
I just didn't know, for instance, who had was this yearbook out, or it was just anyone who had the yearbook was just keeping that secret. I don't know. Do you know? I don't know.
I think the guy that gave it to Time had it since July, I think he said.
Yeah. Which is still quite recent, right, in terms of, yeah.
The question is, why didn't anyone else find it before?
and then
Yeah.
Trudeau's apology, in his apology he also mentioned that he didn't remember.
Yes.
So it's like there's patterns that like definitely show that there's something up, and there's people in communication behind the scenes. Well, that's what I think. So
A lot of questions still. Yeah.
It says it right on top. It was found in July.
Yeah.
Somebody must have done this, was going through his archive, personal archive, I think, and found this book. It says in July, and felt it should be made public. So he approached finance.
Well, and there have been questions in this.
Also talking about the history and the way we remember different events. I tell you, like, you know, and it's confirmed by scientists and stuff. Like, we all remember this day 100% different. Some of us will not remember, and some of them will remember it vividly. So I think, like, you know, in that sense, I kind of give the credibility to the report that somebody does.
You had a comment, and then.
Well, I was just going to ask, because it seems like a lot of people in the room might actually have an answer. I haven't done this, but who's Michael Adamson? Is there,
In terms of his own,
yeah, like how
Wh-
long
it-
people
Well,
have had it.
this is the ethical question.
the ethics. So maybe, and we could go into a very big discussion on this. Maybe I'll leave some of that because Brent's going to talk about ethics next. But I wanted to reflect just on kind of this and see if this also prompted any questions around process, right, as journalists. I mean, here I mean it's a good case study actually, because you hear that another outlet had the photo, did not run it. I mean, it'd be so easy to put that up on social media, right? It would have been.
Because they didn't confirm.
Which is great. That's how journalism should be done, right? Right? Yeah.
My question is, so the American market is different demographic when it comes to race and racism and the response to the communities. So in time in the U.S., the response would be greater because people of color there are more vocal about blackface and brownface. Whereas in Canada, it's not so much. Right? So to me, Time took the lead on it because it's more of a hot topic. Whereas here, it as a person of color, visible minority in Canada, it does affect me. But I can, and we were having a discussion. It's news right now, but in a couple days, it's not going to be. And that's because the majority of Canadians are not people of color. They're not affected by it. So it doesn't resonate
And
in the same way.
And as mentioned earlier this afternoon, not just Canadians, but specifically journalists. And that, I think it has raised a lot of questions around, you know, this is the fourth election Trudeau's run in, second as a leader of the Liberal Party, and why, you know, where are the blind spots from journalists, right? And that should have been an issue, but hasn't been.
Well, exactly, you know, about the members of press, not people of color. Like a lot of my colleagues don't understand what's the fuss is about.
Right.
Aladdin was kind of dark-skinned, you know, thing.
When I
man,
first-
right, like character. So they don't understand what it's about. Like it's very difficult. It's unfortunate. But I guess like the only way is to push that agenda. You know, I guess like even like Trump, my guess is probably Trudeau doesn't understand why it's such a big deal. You know, honestly.
So, yeah.
I think people of color here may not respond or may not make such a big deal out of it because they've kind of enjoyed some kindness on diversity. I've read a lot of reports of citizens' response to these, and I've seen people say, you know what, Trudeau has spoken against racism. Trudeau has been the most divergent shaper of narrative out there. So this does not change what I feel about him. It's not even going to change my decision to vote for re-election. Now, on the flip side, people of color in the US will rise against this because they've experienced, so there's been this kind of decency. Even if racism prevails here, it's in hushed tones. It's been very brazen in the US.
Right.
The president is alleged to be in the frontal vanguard of racism. It symbolizes it. And I am certain that if time had come out with this against Donald Trump, by now, Trump would bully everyone until the American public fall on their knees to believe, oh, it's another fake news. But here, the president stood up and said, okay, yes, I did it. But I'm sorry, it's 18 years ago. I probably didn't even know what I was doing.
Right.
Decency, respect for people of color. Donald Trump will throw it back at you to say it's personal attack. So the people of color here are not making a big deal out of it because somehow the Canadian system has this kind of optics that, you know, people of color are respected. That's all I think.
Don't get it wrong. Can I
We'll,
just say,
we'll have a 1, 2, and 3, and 4. I know. I'll just have to do that to make sure everyone gets in there.
well, what I hear, or what I've heard, is that Global News had it first, and they tried to get confirmation from the Trudeau party. Trudeau party denied it. Then Times got the actual yearbook. Then the Liberal Party said, oh yeah, now I remember. Yeah, I did that. I'm sorry. I don't think, if that yearbook didn't come out, this photo wouldn't have meant anything. Like, Trudeau wouldn't have accepted responsibility. Just because it could be fake, we don't know. But I'm gonna say this about the brown face. When I heard
Keep going.
When I heard about brown face, I was actually happy. And now brown people have something to talk about.
Yes.
Okay, there are two things. One is that the communication, the way the Trudeau team managed this scandal, somehow made me to wonder because, for example, some people, even people who were attending that event in 2001, some of them say, you know what, we were there, and at that time, 2001, wasn't a big deal. Yeah, so for even if it really were an issue, for sure someone from the school will stop him and say, hey, you know what, you better go home and change because this is not allowed here. Yeah? So the first thing. But it was very tricky for him to go and say, you know what, at that time, it wasn't a big deal. No, because people will go after him. He prefers to say, to assume all the thing and to make it like in Canada, because the values that are here in Canada is, you know what, you have to be politically correct and you have to be also polite. So you have to say sorry. Everyone here says sorry for everything that they do, even though they repeat it. So that was the safest way for him to be. And they say, and even there were journalists in Winnipeg asking him, but you know what, some people are supporting you in social media, and they say that it's not a big deal. What do you do is that big deal? He said, oh, because you know what, the people every day that facing discrimination. And then I was thinking, oh, now he's trying to make sure that nobody's gonna be having a space to criticize him more. So, but it's an acting, it's not real. So it's just it's something that, I was speaking with my daughter who has been here since she was 3 years old, she's more Canadian than me. She said to me, and she got some studies in psychology, she told me, Freddie, I think that we should judge if there is a space to judge anyone for their present, not from their past. Even people learn from their own mistakes. And what we are everyone, like every time that you grow up. Yes, so that's silly to do that. He told me that like that. But I was thinking to myself, you know what? What about accountability? Because he said, sorry, but I'm gonna be here forever. But what about your responsibility if you are someone who is a public servant, one who was elected, and one who was promising people to be respecting
inclusive
other
and
people's.
Well, and I hate to bring it back because this is so important, right? I mean, and we could talk a whole day on why this is important, and your voices are important on this topic, but almost to I think draw why this matters when it comes back to disinformation, I think is a couple of questions here, and I think that is it reinforces the idea that photo and video can be very powerful. As the comment, we needed that photo, and the reverse can happen in that if you have a photo that is faked, it can also be equally as, it is dangerous because it's a very, very powerful tool. And then two, I'm curious to know, for those of you, and please bring out the examples of where you do work and the kinds of work you do. When are we fact checkers for our own communities that we represent? When are we supposed to be looking at how the mainstream media reports on certain communities? And when do we call them out? Is it our responsibility? Should it not be our responsibility? Because that's a big responsibility to bear. And what happens when we are doing stories in a different way? And what are our resources there? So I want to kind of hear more on those. I know you have something to say, so I do want to hear it.
I think in the discussion in terms of this story, specifically with the Trudeau story being fake news and with disinformation, I think what made it harder to swallow and easier to believe was that it came from the New York Times. It wasn't something that was spread online, which easily could be fake and just be it could be fake. It could be a bot. It could be someone with a political agenda. The fact that it didn't come from any Canadian outlet first, I think to me that made it seem more real, because I could see this, and this is just cynical journalism side of me, I could see someone holding on to this if, for example, the Toronto Star has a vested interest in not seeing Justin Trudeau come on. I could see them holding on to it for a while to release it at the most damaging time. But in my mind, I don't see
Time magazine.
I don't see them having that thing. I can't see journalists being like, I got the story, I need to tell this to people because it's a public interest story. This is a story that's going to directly affect people. Because yes, it's important. This is a world leader, but you don't have that same inclination isn't there because it's not related to you. If I get some damaging news about Putin, I want that to get out there, but it's not the most pressing thing. So I think in terms of that made it. It's like this. Yeah, this is definitely real because there's no way that everyone could have got this information and passed on it or.
Well, if you would have seen this text, of the article, we got from a businessman named this, from Vancouver. It was printed in this book, and there would be photo of this book and stuff on social media. Would you believe this story?
No, it raises a really important question of how do we present ourselves as credible? Because what if it had come from a smaller outlet that had journalists of color, and would it have been received differently? I mean. Sadly, right? I mean, that's probably true. But I think that's a really important point, especially for those of us who work as independent journalists. But yeah.
Yeah, I think what is important, what we are kind of missing out in this whole thing is we have talked about disinformation, we have talked about misinformation. There is also what can we call uninformation or perception, creation of a perception. And what I mean by that is very clear, I can explain. In the last 4 years, especially since the rise of Donald Trump, a lot of media outlets, and especially main media outlets, have taken a so-called leftist or anti-right-wing stance in their postures, whether it is Washington Post, Time, New York Times, Toronto Star. So they are basically, that is why maybe Donald Trump at times has been referring to them as so-called fake news, and we get disturbed by that. But please hear me out. What I'm trying to say is, with having said that, the media, especially the main media, has developed blind spots towards the so-called liberal leaders or so-called leaders who are in line with their thinking. We have given them far too much leverage. Trudeau's case is a very clear example. I cannot believe that Trudeau was not aware about these pictures in 2015 or 2012 or 2013 when he decided to stand for the Liberal election also. Of course he was aware what he was just about 10, 12 years back. He purposefully decided to not let the Liberal Party know if at all that is true. And definitely he hid something. And definitely if we would have known, the Canadian people would have known in 2015 that this blackface existed, we may not have selected him to be a Prime Minister candidate at that time also. Now, the whole perception, the whole idea is a different thing. Now we are giving him a leverage because we are saying in the last 4 years, he has done so much for diversity, he has done so much for equality. Trudeau is not what he was. That would have not been known 4 years back. So we have given him leverage, and we have, what I'm trying to say is, lack of information or hiding information is also fake, is also creating a perception. So as journalists, we should be aware and we should try to not develop blind spots because the leaders may be of our own views, may align with our views.
I think that's a great point. I think it is important, however, to differentiate between what we encourage as good journalism, and we always have. I mean, there's principles of journalism, finding the stories that aren't being told, making sure they're true, reporting on things that, on leaders, absolutely. And that's always been true. But when we talk about disinformation, and especially in the last few years, it's been really how technology has changed the game around disinformation, how it's being spread, how it's being created. And you'll hear this, there's always been actors who want to get out there to manipulate voters. I mean, what is PR in many ways? It's marketing, right? I think there's a fine line between those things. I mean, what happens when you have a political ad at York University that says, vote, are you sick and tired of your left-wing professors? I don't know if you saw that, right? I mean, these are slogans, sloganeering, right? Those challenges have always existed. But the added challenge to journalism, in addition to the fact that we have an industry with a financial crisis, the models of journalism have changed. And then you've got Donald Trump. I mean, it's been this huge kind of combination of elements that have really, really made this so important, so hard in the last couple of years. But yeah, any other thoughts on that, or just on this particular case? If not, I'd like to hear. We don't need to break out because I want to make sure there's time. How are we doing for time? 4:30. Okay. So why don't we break out? Take a minute, talk to the person next to you or the group. Share where you work. What kind of journalism do you do or want to do or have you done in the past? What kind of fact-checking process do you have? just walk through a story that you've maybe worked on. Are there things that you can do differently next time, or that you'd like to do, but why not? I'd especially like to hear on challenges around, say, checking sources in another language, or how you're going online with, and interviewing somebody across the globe. Those kinds of contexts that I think this is such an important group here, because you have a really, big variety of interests and work. And I work with a lot of different journalists around the world, and I think the challenges there are less heard of, and they're not in, that fall into that really traditional Canadian media bubble, right? We don't necessarily have a really big organization to rely on that has a team of fact checkers. I think it's great that fact checking initiatives have begun, and there's been a real interest in them, but not all of us have that at our disposal. So just take maybe 3 minutes and have a look at some of these questions, and then come back and tell us a little bit about the work you do. Let's hear from some groups just on what you talked about, your work. Let's get a bit of, anyone want to volunteer?
Eva?
Yes?
We nominated him as everything appointed.
I think
It's not to project your voice this way, it's just to get the recording in at the video.
I think what is important today for us is that we have to realize that there could be two different sides of the same coin, of a coin. We cannot go by one view, we cannot go by Google only, we'll have to look at two different views. Maybe the Western view may be different from the Eastern view in terms of any news. We were just discussing about my country and what is happening in Kashmir out there, and how the voice of not 1, 10 or 100 people, more than 8 million people is being muzzled by the government completely. There is a complete blackout of information from that place. Now, you cannot go by what the media is reporting out there, which is completely pro-government. You cannot go by what the government says. You cannot go by what is being reported in the West. You have to have your own. You have to develop more sources, and that is where the journalist antenna or journalist sixth sense or whatever has to develop. You have to develop. You cannot get it over immediately. You'll have to develop that over years. You have to understand that first, as much communication, as much information from different sources you must pick up. Secondly, you'll have to develop your own ground sources of information. If you don't have those sources, then I would recommend that do not report or do not add to any more misinformation without gathering the proper information from different sources. So I think that is very important. If we want to talk about stopping fake information, or if we want to stop the flow of misinformation, we need to rely strongly on our sources, and we need to cross-check many a times, because what we speak out is going to affect the lives of a lot of people. In our country, in India, or in many parts of Asia and Africa, what I have seen is that it is not a matter of just reporting, it is a matter of life and death for journalists, and journalists are getting killed and captured and on a regular basis. So I think it is our extreme duty, even when we report in the West, in terms of ensuring and enabling that our sources are correct and as widespread as possible.
And thank you. And actually, just keep that 1 second. Do you do reporting for publications abroad or here?
I write for. I'm a columnist for Times of India in India. I write for them regularly, and most of the times my columns are censored or edited because of what I write out there. I try to do a piece for New Canadian Media only for Kashmir, and I tried to get information from Kashmir for that. And there was absolute lack of information. My friends, they are not reachable only through their family. One of my friends' family, who is based out of Delhi, was able to get some information, actual information of what's going on there. So it's very difficult, especially in such situations. So that's what I'm saying, that it is extremely important to not rely on governments also, or rely on so-called main media also at times, especially when you cover sensitive areas.
And there's a lot at stake too. I mean, we were talking about the impact on trust in public institutions, the trust in journalism, but our own professional reputation's on the line too, right? When we're writing for, say, a Canadian audience on an issue where we're possibly the only one writing and have sources abroad, there's a pretty big responsibility to make sure. I mean, your editor might not be able to fact check. In a way, they have to trust you, right? So big responsibility there. Yeah. Anyone else like to? Yeah, sure.
So, as important as the issues are in Kashmir, and I don't want to belittle them at all, but I just wanted to go back to the idea of responsible journalism, because my point is that, and I think we discussed it earlier, that just because the Prime Minister had colored his face black some 10, 15 years back, does that, and it's all contextual. So somebody picks it up now to be able to make a political statement out of it. So just a personal story. I just wanted to share that because I think the group will be interested. If all of us do some soul searching and look back in fancy costumes we've worn in our lives, I have photographs on my Facebook where I've worn gears from tribes. Now, if I were to publicize them, people would say, "Hey, this guy is nuts. I got this whole sort of red Indian sort of outfit, right?" Now that's
YMCA.
Right. So now in today's context, that's stupid, right? But if you look back at our own sort of history, like 10 years, 15 years back, this wasn't such a big deal, because we knew what a joke was. We could take a joke. So I'm not trying to defend Trudeau here. I'm just saying everything is contextual. So
but wearing costumes is different from coloring your skin.
Look, I've colored my skin in many colors, and many times in my life. I've tried to be Lord Rama once, and I've colored myself all blue. So somebody might say,
I don't think we'll find the conclusion of that debate here today, but
responsible journalism is about finding the context and say, hey, if I'm putting out my view, and I'll say, what are you guys talking about? This was 20 years back, and times were different. Now, having said all of that, it might still be very sensitive to people today. So somebody who's brought it up to make a point that this guy is not fit to rule this country may have a point, because he had all the time in the world to come clean. So this morning, ironically, I just put that story on one of my social media handles and said, "Can you please talk about the economy?" I mean, everybody will talk about this just to mess with our minds. Can we get back on the agenda about the economy? Because we should be electing a leader which takes the country forward and not talk about fancy costumes. So that's what my view is.
Sure. And I think an important point you make on context is the importance of transparency, because even blind spots in our own reporting, if we've left out how we got the information, who we talked to, right? I mean, all of that information is important. And I think there is now, I mean, I have at the very end of the slides, which you'll just get probably afterwards, because we probably won't get to all of them, but the codes of conduct that now are out, that media outlets have, the guiding principles, the global charters, these kinds of guidelines. I think, we've increasingly seen that move towards more transparency. Public editors, right? Editors who are out there to say to readers, this is how we got the story, this is why we ran it, this is why we knew, we felt, it was worthy or it was trustworthy, and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Okay, so I was looking at how the economy of the media has led us to where we are, where we found ourselves. Because we can discuss the ethics of fake news or original news all we want to from ideological point of view. But realistically, why will someone be in a hurry to break a news? I think it's because he wants to achieve what is called, I broke the exclusive. And it's, if you have the exclusive, that will make you attract the crowd. If you attract the crowd, then your data, the measurement matrix shows that, oh, you got so much followership, and the money comes. So I do think that we need to go to the basics of why is the media struggling, and why are people quick to break fake news. Number two, the misfortune that the world has to grapple with now is the fact that fake news has actually been turned around to become a tool of
engagement for governments, a tool of engagement for those who oppose government.
Can you explain that a little bit more, just on what you mean by a tool of engagement?
The leader of Nigeria, where I came from, and is the opposition leader in Nigeria. As I see his opposition leader, and you realize that it's been hitting you so hard, and then you craft a fake news to say, Mr. Aki, maybe that's his name, was found 2 years ago or 10 years ago to have embezzled $5 million meant for his NGO. And you actually craft it, you put it on Twitter. Because you're president of the country, you have like 3 million followership on Twitter. You know you're lying, but the public sucks it in. And before you know it, it's spread like gangrene, and it's fake news. But the public is the receptor of your news, and they jump at it. And they turn him to public enemy number one. And before you know it, people are calling for his head. So you've made use of fake news as a tool to discredit him. And do we know that that is happening now? It might not be happening in developed world because there are mechanisms for fact checking. But in developing nations of the world, it's being made use of. As I speak to you now, there is a kind of opposition figure in Nigeria who publishes Sahara papers. Sahara newspaper is very popular in Nigeria, the Sahara TV. It was in New York, and it's being locked up now. And the charge the government came up with was, okay, it just said, you know what, let's have a revolution in this country. We need to change the way we spend money. We need to spend taxpayers' money more. And so government is charging him for treason. And the next thing they put out is, oh, we've actually researched him and we found out that he committed a crime of money laundering to the tune of $1 million. And the public is buying it. So fake news has become a dynamic tool where even politicians make use of fake news. That's just
absolutely.
And how do they turn lies into the
they turn lies.
But you know,
into
I
the
guess
truth.
like the discussion here is like should be like how we shall not be helping this politician to turn their Twitter filled with lies into the news.
Is there not?
And that's why I said you have to also consider the fact that what's the media selling and how are practitioners of this trade surviving. People are in a hurry to break the news because if you're in the back end and you're not breaking any news, no one follows you.
I mean, is there no greater example than reporting on what Donald Trump says, right? And I think the media has learned a huge lesson. It's been a really fast learning curve on that because it was, you know, for the beginning, and not to say it doesn't still happen, it does. And you said this is happening in developing countries. No, it's everywhere, right? I mean, the consequences may be different in a place like India or Myanmar. You know, I mean, it has led to violence. It could still be life or death in a different way. If, you know, for instance, it's being reported on what a public health care system in the United States, and if that doesn't pass, you know, I mean, there's all kinds of a snowball effect. But I think that, you know, how we've reported on Donald Trump has been, or the U.S. media in particular, but all because all media covers it.
In the West, it is still, you know, there are still people there looking into it. In Asia, and especially in countries like India, I'm talking about, people are dying on almost a daily basis because of the spread of fake news on WhatsApp and various groups. People are being lynched, people are being killed on those bases. So fake news is a matter of life and death in these countries.
And I just want to say that
Yes,
it's
please.
also, you know, I think journalists should also push back. One person editorial teams. We were just discussing how we had layers of a desk, sub-editors, editors who would send back copies with notes or saying that this doesn't make sense, put a number to this. Where does all of that happen if, like you were saying, you're 1.5% sometime, right? And if it's all going to be, oh, we can't afford the journalists, but we can afford these fake ads. So I think journalists also need to push back and say, no, if you want good news, reliable news, good, you know,
the truth, the fact, you've got to also have that team. We need those people who are not attached to the story to go over it. We need an editor who looks at it, who has maybe better understanding of something and says, you know what, there's a loophole here. You need that team.
Well, and in Canada, we're certainly right in the midst of that debate on when public policy should be involved, right? And so if people aren't going to pay for journalism, if outlets don't find their own money, when does government get involved? And the jury is also out on the various ways it can do so, because there's been a critique on the government response, even though it was trying to help in many ways, but there's been another side to it as well, right?
It's just buying, really. It's a buyout.
For the larger media.
For the freight. Yeah.
Any on this side of the room? Should we, yes, sorry? Yeah.
One thing that, I was chatting with some of our attendees here, and I was telling them that this year I learned a new term, and it was kind of shocking. And I identify now as a recovering journalist, because I'm trying to move from journalism to communications to try to find a safer place where to work and more stable work. But then I was reading this week and it saddened me that the New York Times is closing the Spanish version of it. And it's not only just one language, it's about people who are in the places, who are journalists, who are insiders, who are getting to an international mainstream media, the possibility of getting another view of the reality in Spanish-speaking countries. And if it happens to the New York Times, can you believe what is going on here in Canada, where we have this multicultural setting for hundreds of small community outlets in 200 or more languages? That's incredible.
Yeah.
And there is I was reading that Canadian New Media is making an investigation right now with just partnership with another organizations on how small, they call ethnic media, I don't like that term, are reporting on federal elections. And it is basically based on press releases from the parties and from the government. And it is not because we are not very good journalists, it's because we don't have the means to do the real report of going to everywhere, yes? And trying to get the reality from the places where the rallies are happening and all these kind of things. Very simple as that. So it's more complicated, as you mentioned, because of the business model, and it's easier to be guided by people who got an agenda that is hidden, and we are not able to see it.
I teach media diversity at Mohawk College, and most of the students are white, and we've talked a lot about habits and breaking down, asking the question of why is there a tendency to interview people who sound and look like you, and then what is the consequence of that? And how can we change that? And does it mean you're having to transcribe an interview where you're not quite sure because there's an accent and it takes more time? Yes, of course, it takes more time to be a better journalist, to have more diverse voices, to do the fact checking, right? This is exactly your point, just on the rush that we have, right? But the flip side is there's also an opportunity for voices that represent a different voice, right? And it may be harder to get your voice out there, but there's a need and there's an opportunity. Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, first of all, hi everyone. My name is Nimra. I'm a student here studying journalism. And what I wanted to say is I was listening to what everyone had to say. I wasn't really trying to speak because I wanted to just evaluate and just watch. And what I realized is that everyone has their own opinion at the end of the day. We could debate about everything in this world. And we can go on, and everyone has their own opinion. Some things are more important to people, some are not. With this, I would say, there's people that say, who cares? Trudeau did this, who cares? And then there's people honestly, it did affect me. I'm brown, And again, I can't remember who was talking about, past events, things that happened in the past. And I know, even from my own parents, I realized that,
You always go back to your past. Like, it used to be like that 50 years ago, you know, but you have, like, I want adults to realize that we're in a new generation, that people are, like, constantly changing. Like, news is not really, honestly, this is another debate, but, like, newspapers, they're dying out. Like, where's media? Media is online. We have social media. Like, focusing on fake news now. Like, we talked about how fake news, like, before they were focusing on getting the news out. Now we're looking at what is fake, what is real, how are we identifying it? And it's social media, like, we're all over the world now. So where are you gonna get that information? You have to continuously, like, check. And as a student, like, where do I get my news? I get my news from online. I look at Instagram, I'm looking at Twitter, I'm looking at Snapchat. We have new outlets, we're growing. We have, like, Toronto has a huge, there's 6Buzz. Like, we're the next generation. We are gonna be the storytellers of tomorrow. So how are we seeing this? It's a battle between the generations right now. And yeah.
That's a good question. Just curious to know, when you're looking and finding your news, do you identify where it's coming from, or do you sort of see it in your news feed, or do you see, like, oh, this is from the Toronto Star versus this is like Nar City or some other? Do you see this? Does that nuance resonate?
You know, it's sad that our generation follows what is popular. So if we see something that has 1 million views, we're gonna click on that. Clickbait, there is memes, again, like everything you said, it's so true.
Do you use Reddit?
Reddit? No, but I've heard of other people using it, but I'm sorry. I don't even use Facebook. Like, there's things that, like, trends are gonna die out very soon. There's a lot of things that are gonna... Yeah. So, but I'm not gonna start this.
Thank you, though. Thanks. I'll go 1 and 2 and 3.
I only have one small point, but one thing is I feel like when anyone, but like younger people specifically, talk about social media, like getting their news from social media, there should be a clarification that when you're getting your news on social media, it's coming from media sources. Like, you're then clicking and you are going to that platform. Unless you're just, but that's a different thing. Otherwise, you're just reading the headline. But every time we talk about, like, we have this differentiation between getting your news from social media and getting your news from, like, mainstream media or whatever you want to call it. But young people are still clicking onto the sites of these mainstream media sources. So it's just I don't want to generalize if people are getting their media from social media. You're still reading oftentimes sources.
That's the vehicle to deliver it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I've been in publishing for about 20 plus years, as an editor, and not in hard news, magazine publishing, so general lifestyle topics. So for me, some of the challenges I'm facing is in terms of what I believe is important information for people to get in terms of their health or, general lifestyle. Do I follow what's trending, or do I go to what I really think is important, right? Because usually what's trending is what people are going to be picking up on, as opposed to what I'm thinking they should know, and I'm not even getting 2 clicks, right? So I find that challenging. And then also, just to respond to the gentleman said about perceptions and referring to the outlets like the Toronto Star and so forth, and he's seeing the blind spots in the last 5 years. Well, I've been in this country for 42 years, and there's always been, each publication has a particular leaning, right? And one was more liberal, one's more conservative, and it's been consistent. And I remember many years ago going to I used to go to the courts and watch court cases, and there was the shooting, I think it happened at in Yorkville at Just Desserts, And it had to do with a young black man who went in. And Rosie DiMano was there at the court, as well as Christy Blatchford. And this was my first going and then thinking of journalism and so forth. And I was so surprised the following morning when I read both their articles. I would have thought that they were at two different court cases. Two completely different, and I had my own version. Right? Because I am a person of color, and I saw it through my perspective. Right? So there is, and there will always be, a bias and a perspective, right? But we do need to be more cognizant as journalists. And there's been studies, because there's studies I read 20 years ago. I forget the professor's name at Ryerson. She wrote about it in the media. You know, as a person of color, when we listen to the news as a black woman, I cringe until I hear when they describe the description of the person. Once they don't say a color, I know they're white. Right? The only time they never say white. They never describe if it's a Caucasian person, that they're Caucasian, white, or otherwise. But if it's another or person of color, it's, well, lately they've gotten a little bit better, but so the blind spots, they really, and it's great to hear that you're teaching that course, because it's really really needed. Sorry, and then one more point.
Yeah,
Sorry.
of course.
You were talking about needing, because of the resources and and these outlets needing. Well, you know, because I was a publisher and I understand both sides, that advertising is what pays your salaries, right? And so if clickbait and all these, you know, there has to be something has to be done about it for sure. But this is the thing, and the funds are being divided because now they're going to influencers or different sorts of things that we don't have the luxury where we had two main media outlets and then all the advertising dollars went to them. It doesn't work like that anymore.
It's just that in-house check comes when you have an editorial team.
Yeah, I know.
That really makes a difference.
For sure.
Thank you. I'll have a comment at the back, and then thank you.
The couple of notes that I would say about responsible journalism. I think one of the most important things you can do is just be transparent, and like in all steps of it, it's like, this is where I'm getting my information from. To the point that you were saying earlier, if there is a meeting happening at town hall and a reporter asks John Tory something, when you're reporting on that, if you weren't there, say that when asked about this, Tory responded with such. If you don't know something, say that you don't know something. I think that that's, especially with journalism moving to a more digital space, there is that need and that urgency to get your information out, where you might not fact check everything. You might not, if you don't have the answer for something, you might just say it and then put the answer in there later. So I think part of being responsible is saying that at this time, this is what we know, or more to come. If you have reached out to a person or an office, say that you reached out to them. It's like, if someone's not available for comment, say that you've tried them for comment. And I think that another part of responsible journalism, I'm not sure who had brought it up, but I think you actually brought it up, when it comes to talking to people, if there's a language barrier, if you're talking to someone in, say, Spanish, but you're writing in English, making sure that the translation is as accurate as possible. I know you sometimes do have to interpret something, but you want to interpret things correctly. You want to make sure that the person's intention comes across. And I used to intern at the CBC at one of the radio shows, and one of the things they always wanted to stress when it came to getting guests is this person a good talker? Like, are they articulate? Are they able to express themselves well? And while that's important, especially for an audio medium, not getting caught in relying specifically on expert sources or the same sources. Like, if someone's an expert on a community, that's great. Talk to someone from that community. And I think, with that, being responsible means, especially when you're talking about, I think, racialized groups, not falling into tropes, not using the same language to describe someone or some incident. So one, just for the originality of it, like if 16 people write about something, you don't want everyone to describe the person as wearing a shady black hoodie, just because it's unoriginal, and also it looks like you just got your thing from everyone else. But also, because that image and phrase gets repeated, there's a connotation that comes with that, and that can be very harmful, especially for people in racialized communities. And the last point that I wanted to make about responsible journalism is being aware of your biases. I think that for people, when I first was in journalism school, that was something you were taught, that everything needs to be objective and you can't be biased. But that's impossible, because the way you experience life and see life shapes the way that you think about it, and that does come out in your writing. I think if you're aware of it, you're able to correct for it, and you're able to it's like, if you're a left-leaning person, it's like, how can I write this article without leaning too far left, or without at least glancing at the right? Like, how do I think that you need to be able to understand your biases so that you don't let them cloud your judgment, and you don't let them cloud your writing as well.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more comments. I'd like to ask if anyone who hasn't spoken who would like to add, and then I will give it over to you for the last word. We've kind of just allowed this time but I think this discussion has been great. So I will bring it here one, and then, yeah.
Just quickly, I would like to say that with the fake news, I think the journalists, we have more responsibility now. Before, it was to check the facts and to go to the good source and good interview, something like that. And now we need to continue that. But because of the fake news, and I think some journalists, included like me, we have to just identify who is clarifying something. I remember the CBC report regarding the immigrants amount. That wasn't true. So for me, it was important just to spread in my social media that news about the fake news. For me, was more important than the normal news, because people will absorb probably the fake news as a true. So we are facing time, especially now with the elections. We have to act quickly. Otherwise, the fake news will be absorbed like true. So I think it's complicated, but we have an additional, as a journalist, we have an additional job now, is to report what is fake news.
Absolutely. There are a lot of challenges and reasons why disinformation gets out there. But just so that we don't feel discouraged, right? There are also tools, new tools, a lot of fact-checking sources. Not all are in-house, right? And also just, I think there's a lot at stake, right? Personally, professionally, the larger industry. And so I think, we have to make those decisions around taking that time and being careful. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to say that I know a lot of young people rely on social media platforms like Instagram or Facebook. And yeah, you can fact check yourself, but as you want more legit and what's the word I'm looking for? Verified stories and information, you're gonna turn to the more reputable newspapers that you can rely on. You can't really rely on your buddy on Instagram or Facebook to send you an article that's 100% legit.
And not to say there aren't smaller, especially the digital. I mean, in Canada we see, I mean, there's the Narwhal or the, Discourse Media. There's a lot of new outlets that have cropped up in the last 5 years that are, worth reading. But yeah, we have to also decipher and check to see on, what kind of sources they're using, what kind of outlet it is. And the same goes for us to make sure people want to believe us and are able to believe us, right?